Welcome into Northside Territory, Foul Territory Network's Cubs podcast. I'm Sahadev Sharma with my partner Patrick Mooney. We are your Cubs beat writers over at The Athletic. Patrick, the Cubs have played one game in Japan. They have another game to play. Well, by the time people are listening to this, they'll have played two games in Japan. and uh, what they're doing here, what they've done here, is important to the organization, right? Like I think
Mhm.
fans may not fully realize how important this is for the Cubs, right? They are what two of their best players are Japanese players. Seiya Suzuki is before Kyle Tucker showed up, he was their best offensive talent.
Mhm.
And Shota Imanaga had a brilliant rookie season. You could argue he's co-ace of the staff with Justin Steele, if not the ace. He's the opening day starter. Um, like two of their most important players. If the Cubs are going to go anywhere this year, they need both those players to play at a high level, right? Um, and this is part of a plan. This
Mhm.
isn't random that the Cubs stumbled upon Seiya Suzuki and Shota Imanaga. Um, they are trying to build a winning team for the first time since the core of that World Championship team was traded away, and they're looking for advantages. They're looking for ways to be great again. And one area that Jed Hoyer identified was going to Japan. A lot more talent coming out than maybe a decade and a half ago, and trying to establish a presence there. Be a player in Japan. Um, and they're starting to do that. It seems like they've made real headway.
Yeah, you had this great idea. We always talk to our editors about, what are kind of the bigger swings we want to take? What are projects we can work on? What are, anchor type stories around big events like opening day? And you nailed it of like how the Cubs became this destination. And honestly, I feel like we've covered these guys really well. And like we know kind of the long term trends of the organization. I was still surprised as we reported this out just how much of a focus it was and how much effort and how much respect the Cubs have gained internationally. This is not just the Cubs like puffing their chest out about some kind of like small time spur of the moment thing. Like, no, this
Right.
was a Theo Jed transition, a 2021 trade deadline pivot, a post-COVID opportunity, like all of these things. I just didn't realize how interconnected everything was for this organizational push.
Yeah, and the Cubs aren't going to be the number one team in Japan. They're not
No.
going to. They just can't be. The Dodgers are the Dodgers. They're elite at everything, and the presence they've established in Japan goes back, decades. And Hideo Nomo chose the Dodgers. They have the geographical advantage. Uh, they have the winning advantage. They have the historical advantage. Like so many things go in the Dodgers' favor. Uh, but the Cubs can be number two, and that is kind of a surprise when you consider everything.
Yeah.
Uh, Geography and weather is a huge factor. It just is. It is. Seattle, San Francisco, the Angels. Um, these teams should have more of an advantage than the Cubs. But right now, it seems like the Cubs are kind of in a cluster with teams like Texas, right? The New York teams are players. They're not like
Yeah.
they're always in the discussion outside of like Senga. They're not usually the team that gets the player. Um, but the Cubs are right there, and they're fighting for number two. I think a big reason that they're here, other than like Jed Hoyer pushing this and making sure that they have a ground game out here with multiple front office members being very active, is Yu Darvish played for the Cubs. Yu Darvish loved his time with the Cubs. He loved the city. He loves the city. He loved the coaching staff. He had some great times here as far as performance on the mound. Like his first year was awful. It could have turned into a disaster, right? Um,
Yeah.
and that it didn't, I think, meant a lot to Darvish. Like they didn't. Those things can turn sour so quickly. Things you pay
Mm.
someone a lot of money, and especially that moment where we didn't know what was going on. He didn't know what was going on. There were people like,
Mhm.
"What is this a mental thing?" His elbow, and I don't think that ever happened. There wasn't that interaction between Darvish and anyone with the Cubs, right? People weren't questioning him directly. Um,
It was A-Rod on Sunday Night Baseball, but
sure, yes, yeah,
but that was a
but
moment that could have tipped things.
right, it could have veered off
Mm.
course and gotten ugly. It never did, and it turned into like a pretty great marriage. Um, because of COVID, because of needing to cut money, they had to trade him at a point probably when Jed would have preferred, if he was going to trade him, he would have preferred to have waited, right? And
Yeah.
built that value back up, at least have more of a market than one team. Uh, but Darvish is like a godfather among Japanese players, especially pitchers. They respect him, they look up to him, and he has nothing but good things to say about this organization.
I mean, just an amazingly gracious individual, very introspective. I'm so surprised when we write this stuff of how, yeah, he was bad his first year. There were questions of like the diagnosis took a while to get to. There was A-Rod. When he did pitch, he wasn't that good. He was viewed as this like holding back a team that somehow won 95 games in 2018. He gets traded in the middle of a pandemic, and yet he still is this great ambassador for the Cubs, and that having a good reputation amongst those NPB players is priceless. And Darvish is, arguably going to be one of the most like important Cubs figures of however you want to kind of bracket, maybe since 2000, however you want to look at the long span of the Cubs. We'll see how this kind of unfolds. But in working on this story with you, man, like I was struck by how few teams really are seriously in on these players and how many are coming. This is not, Darvish coming out roughly around the time Theo arrives in Chicago. Uh, they made a bid for Tanaka. Not surprisingly, he signs with the Yankees. They roll that money over to sign John Lester. They get a meeting with Shohei as an international free agent under the whatever CBA term was used back then, with a seriously capped bonus. But it was more of these kind of one-off things, and that the Cubs reorganized in like a major way to kind of create this sphere of influence, kind of plant like a W flag there and be like, we're going to post up and just have boots on the ground and have not just like the face to face credibility, but also like kind of the database of knowledge to know like, oh wait, Shota's working on his slider and it's getting better, or this is how we think his game could translate, in part because scouting and player development and the pitching infrastructure are aligned a lot tighter now. Like to even land just one really good player takes kind of like from the top all the way down to like make it happen, just like that scout on the ground. Like there's a lot of layers to this, and the Cubs are really well positioned for no other reason than the Dodgers can't sign everyone, right?
Right, exactly. I want to ask you about some of their ability to pitch these guys. Let's take a real quick break and come back and talk some more on this.
FT fam, Arena Club is the modern way to collect cards or buy or sell or trade or even grade. And we're highlighting slab packs because this is the new way to rip open a pack, get a really good card, AJ. But also, if you're not into the card, like I know you pulled a Bob Gibson card recently, you can get an offer of 90% of the estimated value and just accept it on the spot and give it right back and maybe try again with another slab pack.
I ain't getting rid of my Bob Gibson autograph card. Bob Gibson ain't signing cards anytime soon, so I'm keeping this one. It gets graded for you. There's no mess. The only thing I wish they had bubble gum. Can they virtually send me some bubble gum, Scott? Other than that, it's awesome. You can buy, sell cards. They grade them instantly for you. And physically, you can also get the cards if you want them. So I'm all for this. This is one of the coolest things I've ever seen.
Yeah, those cards are in your showroom in the app. And then, of course, you can get the card physically sent to you. So right now, you can get 20% off your first slab pack or card purchase by going to arenaclub.com/FOUL. That's arenaclub.com/FOUL. Code FOUL for 20% off your first purchase.
All right, Patrick, you spoke to an agent who is pretty prominent among Japanese players, right? Seiya Suzuki's agent, Joel Wolf, Seiya Suzuki's agent, Yu Darvish's agent, Roki Sasaki, Yamamoto. Obviously, I mean, those are the biggest names outside of Shohei Ohtani in Japanese baseball right now. He was pretty clear when you spoke to him about how much the Cubs have invested here and how good they've kind of turned this into like a real organizational strength.
Yeah, you can't just pop out of nowhere and expect to sign a player. Like, this is why the same small handful of teams seem to get the meetings with the best players, like the finalists. Outside of Toronto Blue Jays popping up for Roki, like, it's very rare. And even Roki's process, if you read Ken Rosenthal's piece in The Athletic, was kind of different with Dentsu, this Japanese Colossus marketing company, kind of being involved in that process as well. But, really you're looking at, there's the Dodgers kind of above everyone else. And then the Cubs are kind of right there with the Padres. The Rangers, once again, due to Darvish, have a big presence over there. And then the Giants and Mariners haven't quite fully maximized maybe those geographic weather type historical advantages. The New York team's always involved in like the posting process on the player, but maybe not as, fully engaged day to day. The Red Sox have pulled back, to our understanding. After that, I mean, you're talking about probably more than 2/3 of the league not really engaged in this in a meaningful way. And I think Joel's made that point of like, you can't not put in the work ahead of time and then expect to have someone like Roki take you seriously. And I mean, beyond Wasserman, there's a small group of agencies that handle these players, and kind of relationships matter here. And I think it's interesting how they've handled Seiya over the years. We don't have all of the details, but
Right.
Joel was very effusive in his praise of how discreet the Cubs have been, how responsive they've been, how flexible they've been, that as Seiya's kind of needs have changed over the years, as they've made asks for help with his kind of support staff. He praised Jed and Carter by name. And then you have these people behind the scenes, like Nao Matsumoto, a longtime Cubs employee who's from Japan, probably one of the most valuable and least replaceable people in the organization, someone who just has this great history with Darvish, with people over there. You can even go to Tommy Hadavi. Just his style really works, particularly with Japanese players. Like, he stresses creativity, a very individualized approach. That's what Darvish had told us last season as well, of like, the Cubs don't have a cookie cutter operation on the pitching side. There are a couple other names we mentioned in that story, where they're of just making things run off the field, of like housing, nutrition, whatever pops up. Joel agreed with Jed's assessment from the winter meetings. Like, the public sees these press conferences and the contract terms and think, oh, wow. Or if there's kind of one dispute, it's, club versus player. But a lot of it is like hey, how's he feeling? Like what's hurting, or like what's going on off the, like a lot of kind of mundane, ongoing conversations just over and over. That's really what the job is, and that they're both in collaboration here, trying to put the player in a
Right.
position to succeed. And the Cubs have largely done that with Japanese players.
Yeah, and part of the reason it could pay off so big, you kind of touched on this. It was like a slow trickle before,
Mhm.
right? It was one every few years of a solid to great player coming stateside. Uh, Pretty much since Seiya arrived, it's been a lot more players, multiple, if not one every offseason, multiple players every offseason. Seiya, Kodai Senga, Shota Imanaga, Yamamoto. These are all recent, and now Roki Sasaki, all recent signees. And we have just this, like, I saw one of them the other day, Kazuma Okamoto, third infielder for the Giants, right? He had a couple hits, well struck balls. Craig Counsell was asked about him. Craig Counsell is well aware of who this player is and was effusive in his praise of this player, right? I'm sure he's on the Cubs radar. I'm sure Counsell is well aware that he's on the Cubs radar. We'll see when he's posted, when he comes stateside. It's not far away. He's going to be playing in the big leagues soon enough. I think Okamoto is I'm using air quotes. He's a third baseman. He actually played first base against the Cubs. There's another one who's a third baseman in quotes, Munetaka Murakami, 25-year-old left-hander, slugger, can hit, some swing and miss, right? But like these guys are coming. They're both going to get paid. They're both going to be highly sought after. And then there's just like this list of pitchers, right? There are like, we know that pitchers, have always been like what people seek from Japan, what the teams have sought in Japan, and there's another wave of them coming, a handful of 4 or 5. Then what I found really interesting, Patrick, and we know this, right? We know this because we see it happen at the signings, but there are guys that either like for some reason fell off a 40-man, couldn't stick with a team. Saw this guy pitch against the Cubs the other day, Foster Griffin, a lefty that kind of fell off a 40-man with the Blue Jays. Now he's pitching well. Is he going to be like this ace? I don't know if that's what they see in him, but like we've seen guys go to Korea, go to Japan, and reinvent themselves, get better, kind of figure some things out, come back and have solid careers. I think something fans sometimes fall in love with, the Shotas and the Yamamotos and the Sasakis, right? Like that's easy. I get why. Like those are the stars, but you need other types of players to fill in the gaps with your team. And it sounds like the guy like Carter Stewart, who was a top draft pick at one point, dealt with injuries, never signed. He's come to Japan and now he's reestablishing himself. And the Cubs it's not just Japan, right? The Cubs are trying to establish themselves as a player in the Asian market. And I think, we've spent so much time over the past month, 2 months talking about the budget. This is kind of a way to circumvent that in a way, right? You're not like Seiya Suzuki. If he's a free agent, he's making like, what did Santander make? A lot more than what Seiya Suzuki's making, right? 20 million plus 25 million. Seiya Suzuki's he's a bargain for what he produces. Shota Imanaga is a steal, right? So you can complain about the budget, and I think it's fair to, but this is a path that the Cubs can take where they don't have to worry as much about the budget and maybe get a ton of excess value in these players compared to what they're paying them.
Yeah, I mean, as an organization, you have to be like, what are we good at? And the Cubs generally don't select at the top of the draft because they're not losing 100 games. They're not going to the top of the free agent market to sign the absolute best players. They don't have a $300 million payroll, but like they do certain things well on the pitching infrastructure side, on the player recruiting side, and that this Asian market they think is about to explode. And whether it's KBO or NPB, there's going to be a lot of opportunities here, whether it's, Foster Griffin, I think was more bottom of the first round, but he's certainly put himself back on the radar. Carter Stewart had this, kind of dispute with the Braves. He was like a top 10 pick out of high school, and he took a very unusual path. And I think both those guys are probably going to make themselves a lot of money, whether it's with the Cubs or somewhere else. Like, these guys are firmly on the major league radar. Like, they have not disappeared at all. And then obviously you have these Japanese players who are seeing the Cubs up close, and Shota and Seiya are two more exceptional ambassadors as these guys and their representatives make, enormous decisions about their futures.
Right. And this isn't like unheard of, right? As far as American players going to Japan or Korea and coming back, like Colin Ray. And I know Colin Ray isn't a sexy name, but he's a productive player. He produces innings. He gets outs. He's an out-getter. Miles Michaelis is another name. I'm blanking now, but there's someone that's Merrill Kelly. Was Merrill Kelly Japan or Korea?
I mean, Pierce Johnson's had a nice little career after coming back. There's definitely examples that people can point to. I mean, Chris Martin, he came back too.
Yes.
Like, there's more than a handful here of, and I think part of it is, we mentioned the story. I mean, pitch data,
right.
It gives a lot of validation. The competition over there is strong. And then these international events like the WBC, like, that has been a huge catalyst for both players kind of wanting more and teams being able to kind of compare a little more closely and taking a little bit of the guesswork out.
Right. I'm going off memory here and like a recent conversation with Jed Hoyer, but something that stood out to them, I believe, was Shota Imanaga starting the WBC. Was it the semifinal or the final? It was the final,
championship
right?
game. Yeah,
it was the final, and he was coming off injury, and the fact that they started him, and had that trust in him that he could handle that moment coming off injury, that they believed he would perform, and he did, I think spoke to the Cubs as well. Like, that was like some intangible factor that they saw as well. And then he delivered, right? Like, so we've talked a lot about Shota this week, handling the moment and the pressure. His teammates are like, this guy doesn't feel pressure. What are you talking about? Like, they're almost like, have you watched him play? Like, he's faced so much in his career as far as pressure, and it never seems to phase him. And like, you can be amped up or whatever, but he seems to handle those moments really well. And being able to play in the WBC, I think is important for scouting. Seeing the scouting side, seeing those guys, how they handle those moments, because they do matter to the players. Seeing them handle it well matters. Seeing them handle, they're pitching with the normal ball, they're pitching against top tier competition, like all this stuff. It helps them like break it down a little bit better. So I think this is you're right. Like, what you started with, the more we dug into this, the more I found it interesting and like a curious angle. Like, this is I like the way it was kind of presented to us as like, hey, we were searching for a competitive advantage, and we're like, oh, it's right in front of our face. This is it. Like, we have it. We don't need to like reinvent the wheel. We just need to scout a different area and really invest in it. It's less about like some data. It's less about like some technological advancement or seam shifted wake or like science stuff. It's just, oh, there's another country full of really good players. I just kind of like that. It's a simple concept that it's like, let's take advantage of this. Other teams aren't, not as many teams. It's reduced competition. When you go from facing 29 teams in free agency to 6, 8, completely changes the dynamic. It's worked out for the Cubs so far. They're two of their best players. And we'll see where it goes. Obviously, they need to win games and really like establish themselves as a consistent contender for fans to care about any of this. But right now, it's a big step in the right direction. Go ahead.
No, I would just say, like, I learned a ton. Like, this is the type of story where, like, you have some conversations, you gather a little more material, and you're like, okay, this puts us as reporters in a much better position to cover this team moving forward. Like, because we'd hear these things over the years, like, oh, well, Jed's in Japan. I think it was like in September 2023 of like, oh, it was, I think they had a brutal loss against the Diamondbacks, and he was watching it like on a runway somewhere. But
Yes.
like it starts to add up, and you're like, okay, well, not all these guys are kind of come over at once, but some of these guys, at least one I can think of was very likely to be coming over next off season. And you kind of have this backstory, whether you're a reporter or a fan, you can understand like what are the Cubs trying to do here, and like Japan and Asia at large is a much larger piece than I think I would have thought of at this time last year when they made the Tokyo series announcement. It was like, oh, okay, international event, maybe they can sell a sponsorship like, on a Wrigley door somewhere to like a Japanese company. And it's like, no, this is a enormous baseball business forward-looking initiative that is not going away at all.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. This is Northside Territory, Foul Territory Network's Cubs podcast. Make sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and subscribe to The Athletic, where Patrick and I are on top of all things Cubs. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. We'll be back with a wrap-up of the series in Tokyo soon enough, and then it will be the U.S. portion of the season creeping up on us. Baseball is here. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Take care.